Okay, U.S. history, here we go. Third video. Again, this is a 2-week unit. I will do my best to make this one the shortest, quickest video of the three. I know that the second one kind of rambled on a little bit, but I feel justified because it's a 2-week unit. So here we go. Let's get into our third video dealing with the Vietnam War. And so kind of where we left off with our second video is 1968 was kind of like a turning point year in the war. 1968, you get the Tet Offensive, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the role of TV, and it's definitely, the United States doesn't look like it's winning. And so we ended it with the 1968 election with the winning candidate, Richard Milhous. That's right, Milhous Nixon, and the Republican Party comes out victorious. Okay, so let's just get right into your first question. Your first question is the 1968 election. So what I would like you to do, first question, is to come up with the electoral college map, something we've done in the past, the 68 election electoral college map. So you have on there Nixon and who he ran against, and also come up with, and I have it for you up here, Nixon's slogan. If you think about it, people who run for office, usually have a slogan. And Nixon's slogan in the 68 election was peace with honor, which meant that, hey, with the war in Vietnam, it was time to do it. We need to end the war in Vietnam with peace, but we couldn't cut and run. We had to do it with honor. We had to do it with kind of like saving face of the United States. So his slogan, which have that into your answer to your first question dealing with the 68 election, his slogan was peace with honor. If you think about it, Donald J. Trump had a slogan back in 2016, and it was to make America great again. He's got a slogan here in 2020, keep America great. Eisenhower was I like Ike. So just about everybody who runs for president, runs for office, they have some type of slogan. And so Nixon's was peace with honor. So your first question, the Electoral College map, also identifying who Nixon defeated, and then the slogan of peace with honor. So again, Nixon wins the 68 election, campaigns on ending the war in Vietnam, but he wants to do it with peace with honor. Helping him, again, that's not Doug Flynn right there. Could be, but it's not. Helping him along the way was like his trusted advisor, Henry Kissinger. So in the 1960s and 70s, when you saw Nixon, you saw Kissinger. They were like two peas in a pod. Wasn't his vice president, but just one of his closest advisors, Henry Kissinger. Again, Nixon basically kind of agrees with Walter Cronkite, saying that the war in Vietnam is not winnable, that we, the United States, cannot win. The war of attrition, the enemy, we cannot win. But at the same time, Nixon says we can't cut and run. And cut and run just basically means take your ball and go home. That means that we just quit and we're going home. He's trying to end the war in Vietnam by saving face, by saving credibility. And again, we are the United States of America. We are a superpower. And so even though we may not be able to win the war in Vietnam, it's kind of like, again, in sports, I know I use a lot of sports analogy, but it's kind of like in sports, like if you got like 3 minutes to go in a basketball game and you're down 19 points, there's a good chance with 3 minutes to go, down 19, you're not going to win. You're not going to come back and win. But what you can do is for that final 3 minutes is still play as hard as you can. Something that we always said in girls basketball, and the boys do it as well, is play to the buzzer. Just play buzzer to buzzer. And so even though we may not win the game, but we're going to play hard, dive on the floor, do whatever we can all the way to the end. So cut and run is basically, that's not an option. When Nixon's in office, he actually increases bombing raids in North Vietnam. And so immediately he's getting some heat because he kind of campaigns on ending the war, peace with honor, but then he increased bombing runs over North Vietnam. And as you can see from the picture, these are just bombs that are just being dropped indiscriminately, carpet bombing basically. And so he's trying to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. So he's trying to bomb like the cities and stuff, just saying, hey, the United States, we're ready to cut a deal. Let's get to the negotiating table and work it out. So he actually increases bombing in North Vietnam. And it's not just military targets, but also cities and civilian targets. At the same time, Nixon starts the transition here of training the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. He basically says, hey, at some point we're leaving. You guys are going to need to defend yourself. And then this kind of deals with one of your questions from the second video. He decides to deal with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so what he does is he starts to secretly bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. So you had to answer the question, what would you do? Would you invade those countries? Would you bomb them? Would you do nothing? Well, Nixon basically says, the enemy is there. The enemy is flowing supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So he secretly bombs the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. He invades Cambodia. And again, this is going against his campaign. His campaign was to end the war in Vietnam. His campaign was peace with honor, but then he increases bombing of North Vietnamese cities. He bombs Cambodia. He invades Cambodia. But again, his justification was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We've got to cut off the head of the snake. The only way to kill a snake is cut off its head. And so he's like, we got to do this with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So he kind of justifies the bombing, but that did not really help much with his credibility and popularity, especially if you voted for him because he promised to end the war. And what you're doing right now, or he's doing, is escalating the war. So obviously he had to explain, why he was bombing Cambodia and, again, Ho Chi Minh Trail. He also bombs and invades Laos. Another turning point, it kind of became known as the Kent State shooting. So following the escalation of the war in Laos and Cambodia, college campuses erupted with protest all over the United States. And this one turned violent in 1968. Kids slamming the door as I'm teaching, no respect. I get no respect around here. Kent State was a school in Ohio, kind of like the size of like Western Michigan, Central Michigan. And anyway, protests turned violent where the National Guard opened fire, killing some college students. And, again, it kind of deals with the fog of war. There's some argument that, that maybe the guardsmen were being attacked. So anyway, the Kent State shooting and the protest really escalated the United States, dividing the United States even more when Nixon escalated the war. Second question is that you need to explain the big idea of the Pentagon Papers. Yeah, the Pentagon Papers. And so the Pentagon, we already know the Pentagon. The Pentagon is the headquarters of our military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and I'll throw in the Coast Guard for Coach DeVries as well. Of course, the Pentagon was one of the buildings that was also hit during the 9/11 terror attacks. And so the Pentagon Papers was basically government documents that was kind of telling the story of the war. And as I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier videos, is that our government wasn't being completely honest about the results of the war. Again, we were kind of releasing images and information that we're winning, that the enemy is losing, but the Pentagon Papers was like the real documentation that things were not going good, and things were not going good for a long time. And so what happens is eventually these papers are leaked. Somebody in the Pentagon gets a copy of these papers, and they probably made a copy of the copy of the copy. And then they took these Pentagon Papers, which were like top secret. I mean, this is top secret stuff. And they released the Pentagon Papers to the newspapers. This is back when newspapers was like the main way that you kind of got your news and information. And so the Pentagon Papers exposed that the government was not telling the truth about the war. Yeah, our government was lying and not really telling, not leveling with the American people. So explain the Pentagon Papers. Again, it was leaked top secret government documents that exposed that our government, our military was not being honest. Now, what happens next, you got to have this in your answer, is that Nixon tries to seal these documents. He basically says to these newspapers that you cannot print, you cannot release these Pentagon Papers because it's based on national security. So we know that our government today operates with the First Amendment, free speech, free press, and et cetera. But there's also some things that are just national security. So I'm trying to think here. So I think we did something back, I don't remember when, but we assassinated and we killed Abu al-Baghdadi. I think that was right around like Thanksgiving and like right around Christmas. And so the raid that killed him was national security. It was top secret. So, obviously, if that information gets leaked, the person who we're trying to capture has a chance to flee. So it's kind of similar to like the Bin Laden raid, that we did at the beginning of the year. No, that was top secret. And so what Nixon kind of argues is that national security here is more important than the First Amendment. The newspapers, of course, they want to release the Pentagon Papers. They're like, look at this information. This is big news. The government's not telling the truth. And so it kind of became a debate between what's more important, national security or the First Amendment. Well, it basically goes all the way to the Supreme Court. You can't get any higher than the Supreme Court. And at the end of the day, the Supreme Court ruled that the newspapers had the right to print the Pentagon Papers. In other words, to tell the story that our government was lying and it wasn't telling the truth. And so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the First Amendment. So your second question, Pentagon Papers. What were the Pentagon Papers? The big idea, again, was these papers kind of told the story of the war in a sense that the government wasn't being honest. And at the end of the day, when it became between the First Amendment and national security, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of free speech, the First Amendment. Okay? Well, what happens now is something called the War Powers Resolution. And this is important because if you can think back to our first video, the Gulf of Tonkin incident led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution kind of allowed the president free rein to do what he needed to do in regards to war. The War Powers Resolution took that power away. So this is when Congress basically takes back or it repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So now, if Nixon wanted to do something with like Laos or Cambodia or escalate the war in Vietnam, he'd have to get approval through Congress, and that just wasn't going to happen. So the War Powers Resolution takes away the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. There's a peace deal finally signed to end the war in Vietnam in 1973. Probably one of the biggest differences now versus the end of the Vietnam War is, our troops today coming home from Iraq or Afghanistan, or if we see them at an airport, or if we see them, at a restaurant or a gas station, we shake their hand, we thank them for their service. Troops coming home today come home to a hero's welcome. And in Vietnam, that did not happen. Our troops coming home from Vietnam did not get a hero's welcome. They were kind of like, people would throw insults at them. They would call them baby killers. They would they did not come home to any ticker tape parades. And so, not a good homecoming for our troops in Vietnam. This is basically pulling out of Vietnam. As you can see, not everyone's going to get on that helicopter. By 1975, there's no longer two Vietnams. If you remember when we started this, it was North Vietnam, South Vietnam. When it's all said and done, there's only one Vietnam. And the whole country now is communist. So at the end of the day, not only was the war in Vietnam not winnable, I would even say that we lost. Saigon was the original name of the capital of South Vietnam. Well, if you're in South Vietnam today, the name Saigon is removed. It is renamed Ho Chi Minh City. So it's kind of like how we name things after like George Washington and some of our other leaders. And so Ho Chi Minh City was named after their revolutionary leader. Last question. Again, this will be a short video. The effects of the Vietnam War. The list is long, but I kind of narrowed it down. This was not a good time period for the United States. Obviously, when you win a war, when you win something, everybody feels good about themselves, or they feel good about things. Obviously, when you lose, obviously a little bit different. So some of the effects of the war in Vietnam, following Vietnam, the United States turned more isolationist. Obviously that's changed, but for a while there, we kind of took that philosophy of we need to mind our own business. Our credibility of being a superpower, our credibility of doing good was damaged, because we did some horrible atrocities in the war in Vietnam, and we didn't really get into it much. I might cover some of that stuff in our on decks for the next 2 weeks. but our credibility of being the superpower and our credibility of doing right was severely damaged. And it also kind of really marked the beginning of not trusting our government. The government was lying, wasn't being honest. Again, the Pentagon Papers was clearly outlined. Our government was just on purpose. There's one thing of making a mistake, and then there's one thing of doing something on purpose. And just really kind of began the thick lack of trust in our government. And I would even add a fourth. I don't have it on here, but we learned from our mistakes. As in Vietnam, and since Vietnam, obviously we've had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and some other small skirmishes elsewhere, but we've kind of learned some hard lessons from Vietnam and became maybe a little bit brighter, maybe a little bit smarter, maybe tactically a little bit better in those situations. So we probably learned. So I would say, if you add a fourth one to the effects of the war, we became more isolationist at the time. Our credibility was hurt, lack of trust in our government, but we also learned from our mistakes. And I think we probably became better militarily, learning from our mistakes. So that is the third and final video. So again, your three questions were the 68 election, Nixon's slogan with an electoral college map, explaining the Pentagon Papers, and then the effects of the Vietnam War. And that is it. That's the end of the videos. So hopefully this will help get your living document done by the 29th of May.